Starting now, you can get a transcript of each week's Rich Dad radio show. Just visit www.richdad.com/radio and download a copy today.
This is the Rich Dad Radio Show, the good news and bad news about money. Here's Robert Kiyosaki.
Hello. It's Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show, the good news and bad news about money. And my sweetheart Kim is in Hawaii. And today we have a very important show. As you know, you may know, the Rich Dad Company was founded as a financial education company. And one of the reasons we founded as a financial education company is the gap between the rich and everybody else is now extremely wide. And that is not healthy for any economy. So today we're going to be talking about education and what happened to education in the last 50 years and how education, or the lack of what I call financial education, is keeping many people poor, their parents, the baby boom generations, and their kids, because, many people feel the millennials the hope of the American dream is gone for the millennials. And the baby boom generation has been the luckiest generation in world history, but many baby boomers are now in the same boat as their kids. So this is, again, a show about education. Our guest today, I love this guy, is Steven Brill. I was walking past a newsstand, and generally I'm looking at, the pictures of cars and pretty women on the magazines, but here was Time magazine with the headline, how my generation, the baby boomers, broke America. And I had to pick the article up. And, Stephen, the problem with that article is it set back my book about 6 months. I was just about to go to press on my book, Fake, about fake money, fake teachers, and fake assets. And then I read that little article. Then I had to get your book, Tailspin. And now I'm in a tailspin because I have to catch up, because what you said, how my generation broke America, is exactly why the Rich Dad Company was founded. So my sweetheart Kim is in Hawaii. Anything you want to say, Kim, before we get started with Steven?
Yes, no, I'm excited to talk to Steven because as I was going through all of his interviews and things, I was surprised. I always thought that when you talk about what broke America, I always thought it was the elites of the wealthy and these kids that came up, at Harvard and Yale, but they were very privileged. And what Steven is saying is that's not the case. It actually is much different. So I'm anxious to get started. And Steven's book is called Tailspin: The People and Forces Behind America's 50-Year Fall and Those Fighting to Reverse It. And congratulations, because I understand it's a bestseller as well.
Yes,
so welcome,
it is.
Steven.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So, Steven, would you mind explaining, you and I went to school on the same island. It's called Long Island. And I went to school in Great Neck, which is not too far from Queens, New York. And Great Neck is possibly the richest zip code area in New York. And the rich live there. And I went to school there. I wasn't one of the rich guys. But would you explain how it started? You were a kid growing up on Long Island. There's a thing called the prep school system. Would you mind starting with that? That's where we start the interview.
Sure. I grew up in Queens in a middle-class family. My father owned a small, perpetually struggling liquor store. And one day when I was in the 7th grade at junior high school, 198 in Queens, I was playing basketball, and I wasn't a very good basketball player, and I came down and landed on my knee and broke my knee. Now, why is that important? Because in those days, if you were in a cast or had to use a cane or crutches, the New York City public schools didn't let you attend, which was great for me because I got to stay home from school for a month. But I was a little bit of a bookworm, and I picked up a biography of President Kennedy, who had been assassinated the year before. And in this biography, it said that he went to a school called Choate, which was something called a prep school. And it sort of intrigued me. When I got back to junior high school 198, I asked my teachers and a guidance counselor, what's a prep school, what's Choate? And they had no idea. And I did a little more asking around and found out that a prep school was this place that had, a beautiful campus, and you could basically go to high school as if you were going to college on a beautiful campus, and you could take your classes there. The sports facilities, were all, really good. And then I found out that some prep schools were even offering financial aid to people who had really good grades, and I had really good grades, and on my own, I just applied to various prep schools. Not Choate because it didn't have a swimming team, but I applied to Hotchkiss, which I didn't like because they said that the financial aid kids had to wait on the dining room tables for the non-financial aid kids. But Deerfield had a financial policy where the headmaster basically told my parents when I went for an interview that their financial aid policy was that my parents could write a check every year for whatever they felt they could afford.
So Deerfield is in Massachusetts, is that correct?
Right.
Okay.
Yes, it's in western Massachusetts. Beautiful place, beautiful campus. As nice as any college campus in the country.
Now, wouldn't you say that most of the your fellow students, would you say most of them were inherited wealth? I mean, they came from rich families.
Totally. Completely. In fact, in my dormitory my freshman year, which was a small dorm, there were 14 or 15 kids, and early on they asked me where I lived, and I said I lived in Queens, and they said, "Where's that?" And these kids, most of them lived on the Upper East Side in Manhattan, in Park Avenue apartments or Fifth Avenue apartments. And they said, "Where's Queens?" I said, "Well, have you ever been to LaGuardia Airport or Kennedy Airport?" And they said, "Oh, yeah." I said, "Well, that's Queens." One of the other kids knew where Queens was because his family owned the New York Mets, who play in Queens. So that was, the difference in the mindset of most of the people who were there versus my mindset. 3 years later, I found myself sitting in the headmaster's office, which he had given over to the director of admissions at Yale, who was interviewing me because, once again, at Deerfield I had really good grades. And the dean of admissions was a guy named Inky Clark. And he looked at my record and was really, wondering, how did you get to Deerfield? And I explained, reading the Kennedy biography, and I applied by myself. And he looked again at my record and said, "Is Yale your first choice?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "Well, do you promise that you'll go?" And I said, "Yes, if I get accepted, I'll go." He said, "Okay, I can promise you you're in." And that's how I got admitted. And it turns out that Inky Clark was leading the meritocracy revolution that was beginning to take hold at most of the elite institutions around the United States.
Would you explain the meritocracy revolution? Because, see, the big difference here is the rich kids. And I went to a rich kids school. Mm-hmm. And most of my classmates went on to prep schools like Hawaii Prep or Punahou.
Right.
Or Punahou, where Obama did. Mm-hmm. And what Steven is talking about is in the 60s, around that time, there was this movement to take so-called poor kids who are smart and mix them in with the inherited wealth kids and see what would happen if we educated them. And that's really kind of where the story of Rich Dad, Poor Dad started, because my mentor was a man named Dr. R. Buckminster Fuller, who was 4 generations Milton Academy in Massachusetts and 4 generations Harvard. And what I'm explaining here is that how education has affected all of us, especially today. And that's why Steven's book, Tailspin, is a powerful story. So anyway, they go and they find so-called very smart poor kids or average kids, and then they educate them in the best schools. Is that what happened in the 60s?
And that was a great thing for me. And it turns out I was one of what was known as Inky's boys, Inky Clark's boys. And my wife, because Yale also decided that if they're going to have a meritocracy, they should admit, the other 50% of the people who had good grades, and that means women. So my wife was one of Inky's girls, and that was terrific. I did well in college. I got into Yale Law School.
So you went to Yale undergrad and then Yale Law School.
And then Yale Law School. So what I discovered in trying to figure out what had happened to the country over the last 50 years, what I discovered was that while meritocracy is obviously a great thing, equalizing opportunity is obviously a great thing, it had morphed over the next generation into a new kind of aristocracy that was more entrenched than the previous aristocracy.
I mean, than the rich white guys, what you're saying.
Yeah, because
and how did that morph, Stephen? How did that morph into a new aristocracy? I thought meritocracy is what was supposed to be so healthy.
Well, what has happened is a perfectly natural thing. People like me met people like my wife. We had kids. Our gene pool is arguably pretty good. We had kids, and by then we could afford, because of all the opportunities we'd been given, we could afford to send our kids to the best private schools,
the best prep schools, best universities, all
right.
that, on and on and on and on.
And when it came to applying for college, we and everybody like us could afford to get our kids the best, tutoring for college boards, the best resumes, for summer jobs. Now, I'm not knocking my kids, who, and no one would, but one of my kids was the valedictorian of his high school, so it's not like he's a slacker. But
did he go to prep school also?
He went to a private school in Manhattan. Now, the fact is that if you look at the economic diversity of a place like Yale or Harvard today, it is less diverse than it was in the 1970s. But the new wealthy kids are the sons and daughters of people of my generation who rose to the top. Now, what's the broad consequence of that for the rest of the country? The broad consequence is that as the elite education institutions started operating on merit, which is a good thing, the law firms and the banks and the consultancies and the businesses that Wall Street that were fed by those elite institutions started hiring on merit, which means they were hiring smarter, tougher people. And smarter, tougher people in the 1970s and 80s became the financial engineers on Wall Street and the legal engineers on Wall Street, who created stock buybacks and corporate takeover fights, derivatives, mortgage-backed securities, all the different pieces of legal and financial engineering that have turned our country from an economy that makes things and employs a broad cross-section of people into an economy that consists mostly of the financial services industry, which doesn't employ a broad swath of people and which places a premium on short-term focus on a stock price, not on long-term investment in a corporation and in the country.
And Stephen, you call this the knowledge economy.
Right, which again sounds like a great thing, and it is a great thing until you realize that the knowledge economy is basically going to be dominated by people who have, the best credentials.
And you said part of the problem too is the knowledge economy. They don't create a single product. They don't build. They don't innovate, and they don't create a job. They don't create jobs.
Software engineers would probably be the exception to that, but that's basically true. If I come out of school and I become a lawyer, and what I do as a lawyer is create an arbitration clause that keeps, rank and file consumers and rank and file employees out of courts and having to arbitrate in kangaroo courts, that's not good for the common good. It's good for the client.
Yeah, so we're talking to Steven Brill. He's the author of the new book, Tailspin. We're talking about how education is actually causing this massive, massive divide between the 1% and everybody else. And I'll close with Daniel Markovitz, who gave the commencement address at Yale Law School. And he basically said to this elite class of the brightest students in the world and America, he says, you guys are snuffing out the American dream. I mean, our education system for the elite, bright, smartest kids of all, who are building assets that are not assets, like credit default swaps and derivatives, is actually making it so hard for average people like me to make it. So when we come back, we'll be talking more to Steven Brill, and we're talking about how the education of the elites is one of the biggest challenges facing not only America, but the world today. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Rich Dad Radio Show with Robert Kiyosaki.
Don't be like Charlie. Charlie is that do-it-yourselfer who does himself in. Do-it-yourself is good for tile and grout. It is not good for asset protection. Charlie thought he'd save a few dollars forming his LLC online. With no guidance, he did it wrong. When he sold the property, he lost thousands and thousands of dollars. He did himself in by trying to do it himself. Don't burn yourself. Use Corporate Direct to set up and maintain your LLCs and corporations. Corporate Direct is owned and operated by attorney and rich dad advisor Garrett Sutton. Garrett wrote the bestsellers Loopholes of Real Estate and Start Your Own Corporation. He is Robert Kiyosaki's attorney for asset protection. He and his team will do it right. Visit them at corporatedirect.com or call 800-600-1760. Mention Rich Dad and receive $100 off your formation fee. That's corporatedirect.com. corporatedirect.com.
Log on to richdadradio.com while you listen. Now back to Robert Kiyosaki.
Welcome back, Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show, the good news and bad news about money. And once again, you can listen to the Rich Dad Radio Show anytime, anywhere on iTunes or Android, and all of our programs are archived at richdadradio.com. We archive them simply because repetition is one of the best ways to learn. So if you listen to this program again, you'll pick up even more. But more importantly, listen to this program to family, friends, and business associates. And this is especially true if you have kids. You know, what does school teach you, and why are some kids have a head start so far ahead of your kids, especially if you didn't go to the private schools? And the story of Rich Dad, Poor Dad actually begins in a private school. I went to a little school called Riverside School. Across the street was Union School for kids of the labor unions. And Riverside School were the kids that owned the plantations, the car dealerships, the meat packing companies, the ranches. And all of my classmates then went on to prep schools like Hawaii Prep and Punahou, where poor kids like Obama went to school. And they picked up these poorer kids. Of course, I wasn't one of them, but they turn them into these elites. And that's the problem today, is what Steven Brill is talking about, is how my generation, the baby boom generation, or more should I say the elites, have actually been creating this gap between the 1% and everybody else. So, as you know, the Rich Dad Company is about financial education, which we don't have anywhere in school. And it seems to be many of these elites, you know, like Obama and Clinton, who was another one of those guys. But you also had guys like George Bush, the Kennedys, and Mitt Romney, but also Trump went to great schools like this. If you're rich, you get a better education. So that's kind of the gist of this show. But most importantly, is what are you going to do about it? You know, we can complain and cry and say, well, the rich kids got a better education. Well, so what? That's been going on for centuries. What are you going to do about it? Any comments, Kim?
Well, our guest is Steven Brill, and he wrote an excellent book, highly recommended, called Tailspin, The People and Forces Behind America's 50-Year Fall and Those Fighting to Reverse It. And, Steven, if I can just start with a question. You kind of, because of this knowledge economy now, you've divided pretty much America into two classes of people. Can you explain that?
Sure. I think the division in America is not between Democrats and Republicans, and it's not between conservatives and liberals. It's really between the protected and the unprotected. The protected don't have to rely on government for pretty much anything at all. I mean, maybe to renew their passports, though, they can hire someone to expedite that.
Or the police officer that comes to the door when they're being robbed.
Well, except they can live in gated communities.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
And the
ourselves.
really wealthy people can have their own, bodyguards.
Right.
And, they don't have to worry that our airports are a disgrace because they don't have to fly, commercial airliners. They don't have to worry about, taxes because they've basically been able, through their lobbyists to rig the tax code. The unprotected, which is pretty much everybody else, rely on government not because they don't work hard or they're not self-reliant, but they rely on government for the basic common goods that any government is supposed to provide and has always provided in our history and in any other good country's history. That means public schools, which are the ticket to economic opportunity. The rich don't have to worry about our public schools because they send their kids to private schools, or they live in wealthy communities where the property taxes are high enough because the houses are valuable enough that they can fund really good school systems.
For those who may not know this, the education system in America is built on property taxes. So if you live in a rich neighborhood, you get a better school system than the poor kids.
Yeah. Now, by the way, there's another element of protected versus unprotected. It's not just money, because the fact is, in the United States, across the board, whether it's in Newark or in Beverly Hills, we spend more money per capita on K-12 education than pretty much any other country in the world, and our results are terrible. And that's because the teachers' unions so control the school system that they're not accountable. So, but the rich don't have to care about the teachers' unions, controlling the school systems. But the teachers' unions are another element of a protected class, believe it or not, because they get to hire their bosses. They are a lead factor in democratic politics in any city in the country, and therefore, the person they choose to be mayor or head of the school board is usually the person that wins and then negotiates the contracts with them. So that's another element of, the protected. But to come back to the main point, if the government doesn't provide the common good, the protected don't much care. In fact, they kind of like it because, another version of the common good would be, strong antitrust laws or strong laws, governing the safety of the workplace, so strong laws protecting consumers. That's the common good, but those common goods actually tend to threaten the protected. So they fight as hard as they can against those common goods. And what's happened in this country is we have fallen out of balance. Any country is always dealing with the balance between, individual achievement, individual, hopes for wealth and for the well-being of their families versus the common good.
And also you say that every politician or every congressman has at least 20 lobbyists, hitting them up, giving them money to vote for the richest point of view. Right,
and they live they work in gerrymandered districts for the most part, so therefore the only thing they have to worry about is whether they adhere to their base, whether it's a Democratic base or a Republican base. So that's why we have the polarization that we have. There's nothing in it for a politician to work for the common good.
So the idea that one man, one vote, or one person, one vote is kind of an obsolete idea.
Well, again, that started out as sort of a good thing. Modern-day gerrymandering was created so that
would you explain gerrymandering? How do you gerrymander an election or a district?
Sure. Gerrymandering is when the state legislature chooses how a congressional district or a state legislative district is divided up. What are the boundaries? And it's not just like they take, 8 squares, perfectly formed and logical, to make up the 8 congressional districts in a state. They will, the things will wiggle around. They'll have odd shapes, all engineered, if you're a Republican-controlled legislature, all engineered to get as many Republicans elected as possible.
You gerrymander means you draw the boundary lines of where the votes come from. Okay.
So you lump, let's say you're a Republican, you figure out a way to lump all the Democrats into one district, and that way the Republicans can win the other 7 as opposed to, evenly spreading Democrats and Republicans.
So that means that what Kim's asking the question on the protected versus the unprotected, that means if you don't have money, you're unprotected in the electoral process.
Well, that's true. And if you don't have money, you're unprotected in Washington, because when your representatives get there, they have to be dependent on the people
money.
who give them money.
Right. And there's 20 of those guys, every one of our congressmen.
There's a scene in the book where I spend an entire afternoon, 5 hours, with a congressman in a little windowless room about a block from the Capitol building, where he's on the phone dialing for dollars, 5 straight hours, and he does that every weekday, and he is typical. That is what our Congress has become.
And then he goes to fundraisers at night.
Right. Yep. And the fundraisers at night are organized by guess who? The lobbyists who need to lobby him. And they bring their clients to the fundraisers, and their clients, not you and me, but their clients are the ones who get access to him.
So once again, it's Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show. We're talking to Steven Brill. His book is called Tailspin. Please get the book. I first came across him walking past a newsstand with Time magazine on it. It says how my generation broke America, and it's about the baby boom generation, but more as the education system based upon a prep school system, where the best and the brightest go to the best schools, and that involves the Clintons and the Obamas and things like this, also the Bush and Mitt Romneys. And so for those of you who send your kids to private schools, you're being hosed. That's pretty. You don't have much power anymore. So once again, being that we're a financial education company, can you explain? This is the thing I really appreciate your writing, is about how the elites, the financial engineering, it's called, on Wall Street and in our banks and with the attorneys. We built an economy built on deals that moved assets around rather than building new ones. So we wonder why we don't have jobs and all that. Is because there's more money, taking derivatives of these phony assets, and all these elites make billions of dollars on phony assets that are called derivatives. And meanwhile, the average guy is buying and holding in the stock market, but the whole system is rigged against the average mom-and-pop 401k investor. Would you explain that whole process?
Well, you put it well, but buying and holding is what the average investor might do, but it's not what the savviest inside investors do. Beginning in the 1970s, a doctrine emerged called, shareholder democracy, that a shareholder should be the only thing that management worries about, because after all, the shareholders are the ones who own the company. Now, that sounds great. Again, it's one of those things like the First Amendment. It sounds great. But the way that was hijacked was, the suggestion was by a bunch of Harvard Business School professors that the way to do that is to pay the executives of a company on the basis of how much the stock goes up each quarter or each year. Now, if you're managing for the quarter so that your stock goes up each quarter so that your stock options are worth more or your bonus is worth more, you behave differently from that shareholder who buys and holds, because what you're trying to do is do anything, even things that are artificial, to get the share price up. And what you're not trying to do is invest in the long term, because if you invest, let's say, in a product that may or may not work out over the next 2 or 3 years, that's money you spend today, which is going to hurt your bonus today because the company's earnings go down today, and you may not see it for 2 or 3 years, which is the way a long-term shareholder thinks, and it's the way the economy needs to think, because the economy depends on people investing in new products and new assets and expanding, not disinvesting by doing, for example, a stock buyback where the corporation actually buys shares back on the market, which raises the price of the shares. It increases the earnings per share, as I'm sure you've taught your listeners, because if you have fewer shares, if you're earning the exact same amount of money but you have fewer shares because you've bought shares back, the earnings per share go up, but you haven't done anything. You haven't created anything new. You haven't created any assets, and you've lost jobs because the money you need to buy back the stock is money that you get by doing layoffs or by not expanding or by doing
cutting expenses.
Outsourcing, by anything you can do in the short term to cut expenses.
Yeah, and the biggest expense for most companies are their employees, so you get rid of them. Hey, Kim, any questions for Steve before we go?
Yes, I do have another question. I've got a lot of questions, but one is, you use a great analogy, Stephen, on when you have these talented, driven people chasing the dream, and they get theirs. They're like, yeah, I'm winning. I got all my money, and then you say, and then they pull up the ladder. What do you mean by that? They pull up the ladder so nobody else can get theirs.
It's not a conscious decision. It's not like they say, okay, I got mine, and they don't wake up in the morning and say, okay, I got mine, and I don't care about anybody else. What they do wake up in the morning and say is, my company or my law firm is doing really well, and the way I can do better, let's say I'm a law firm. The way I can do better is think of new and better ways to serve my wealthiest clients. And the process of doing that pulls the ladder up because, for example, if you're trying to reform labor laws to level the playing field between employer and employee, and you're a really clever labor lawyer and you think of a really clever way to do that because you're part of the meritocracy and you're, a premier knowledge worker, you get wealthier by doing that. But the sum total of that product is that the middle class gets hurt.
I think another thing that I don't know if you said it exactly like this, but if you're really, really rich, you can hire the best attorneys.
Right.
And if you're a government guy, you can only hire the third-tier attorneys to fight.
That's right, and that matters. For example, I'm going to come back to this. Something I mentioned before. You all remember the Wells Fargo scandal, right?
Right.
Where they set up accounts for people who had accounts at the bank. They set up new accounts for them. They didn't know anything about the accounts. They got charged, service charges for these new accounts that they never signed up for. And in many instances, their credit ratings were hurt by these phony accounts because when they didn't pay the service charges, they got dinged on their credit ratings. So it's a perfect example of when you would do what's called a class action, where thousands of people are allowed to get together and hire one lawyer to sue the bank on behalf of the class. Well, it turns out that when they signed up for the first account, the real account that they had, they agreed in small print to an arbitration clause, forced arbitration that doesn't allow any kind of class action. Now, when they brought the class action for the phony accounts, the Wells Fargo lawyers, who were at a super successful, mostly liberal firm in Los Angeles, made the argument, the clever argument, that you can't bring these suits for the phony accounts because when you signed up for your real account, you agreed to arbitration, and the language said you agreed to arbitration for any and all business involving this account or any other business you have.
Would you explain the difference between arbitration and the lawsuit for that layperson?
Well, an arbitration is it's private, first of all, and the key is you can't do a class action. So you have to pay individually your own attorney, and the other 1,000 people each have to pay their own attorney. It becomes 1,000 cases instead of one case. Instead of 1,000 people chipping in to hire a good lawyer, it's you who may have, you may have had $800 in damages, and you can't hire a lawyer to sue, Wells Fargo for $800 in damages. If 2 million people have $800 in damages,
right,
they can get together and hire a real lawyer who can really make a case.
So that's why this is Steven Brill. His book is called Tailspin: The People and Forces Behind America's 50-Year Fall and Those Fighting to Reverse It. And once again, it starts in prep schools. Like I said, my teacher was Buckminster Fuller, 4 generations of prep school in Harvard. And then all of a sudden in the 60s, they started bringing up people like Steven Brill, very smart kids, but they weren't the inherited wealth. And the idea was that they would give them meritocracy. They would earn their wealth, but the same thing kind of happened again. Is that a summary, Steven?
It certainly is.
And so that's why with this massive, massive gap today between the haves and have-nots. Final comments, Kim?
Well, just one more question, because I know we're running out of time. In your title, Stephen, you say, and those fighting to reverse it. Who's fighting to reverse this whole situation?
Well, thank God you asked. Each area that I write about in the book, whether it's financial engineering or the rise of the corporate free speech movement or the decline of our infrastructure, I highlight groups and people who, despite events and everything else we see that seems to be galloping in the opposite direction, have the resilience to be coming up with plans and organizing groups to fight this stuff. And my theory is, and my hope is, that when the level of disgust in this country, reaches a certain, boiling over point, which I think we're on the way to, that these people, these resilient, symbols of American resilience, will be there to lead the way in all these spheres to get the kind of reforms we need.
Well, Stephen, I really thank you for your courage and for your eloquence in writing Tailspin as well as that Time Magazine article. And I give you a lot of credit for even self-criticizing your own group of people, is the kids who came from less inherited wealth and then became the elites. So thank you
Well,
very
thank you.
much. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Thanks for
Steven.
having me.
So when we come back, we'll be going to the most popular part of our program, Ask Robert.
You're listening to the Rich Dad Radio Show with Robert Kiyosaki.
Don't be like Charlie. Charlie is that do-it-yourselfer who does himself in. Do-it-yourself is good for tile and grout. It is not good for asset protection. Charlie thought he'd save a few dollars forming his LLC online. With no guidance, he did it wrong. When he sold the property, he lost thousands and thousands of dollars. He did himself in by trying to do it himself. Don't burn yourself. Use Corporate Direct to set up and maintain your LLCs and corporations. Corporate Direct is owned and operated by attorney and rich dad advisor Garrett Sutton. Garrett wrote the bestsellers Loopholes of Real Estate and Start Your Own Corporation. He is Robert Kiyosaki's attorney for asset protection. He and his team will do it right. Visit them at corporatedirect.com or call 800-600-1760. Mention Rich Dad and receive $100 off your formation fee. That's corporatedirect.com. corporatedirect.com.
It pays to listen. Now back to Robert Kiyosaki and the Rich Dad Radio Show.
Welcome back, Robert Kiyosaki, the Rich Dad Radio Show, the good news and bad news about money. Because the Rich Dad Company is a financial education company. As you know, question I always ask people, what did school teach you about money? The answer is nothing. So once again, we want to thank Steven Brill. He's the author of this fantastic book, Tailspin, The People and Forces Behind America's 50-Year Fall and Those Fighting to Reverse It. Steven has really put me in a tailspin because I was just about to come up with my book, Fake, because the entire Rich Dad Company is started because of what Steven talked about. It's how the elite kids go to prep schools and they get the best education possible. And the reason I know that is that was a story of Rich Dad, Poor Dad. When I was 9 years old, I raised my hand in class and I asked my teacher, said, when are we going to learn about money? The teacher says, we don't teach you about money. And I always thought that was strange. And my poor dad, head of education, said, the government doesn't let us teach you about money. And that's when I went and started studying with Rich Dad. And that's where the story began, because most of my classmates went on to prep schools. They went on to Hawaii Prep in Hawaii, Iolani, Punahou, where Obama went. And what Steven Brill is talking about is how in the 60s and 70s they started looking for these very bright poor kids. And they educate them, and these very bright poor kids have actually screwed the economy. So it's a fantastic article, and it just fits right into where the Rich Dad Company was founded. Once again, you can listen to the Rich Dad Radio Show anytime, anywhere on iTunes or Android, and all of our programs are archived at richdadradio.com. We archive each program because repetition is how we learn. You can listen to us again, you'll pick up even more. But this program is especially important, especially if you have children, or you have friends with children, or you have business associates with children, and ask them this question. What does school teach you about money, and how do you protect yourself from those kids who got the best education in the world and screwed everybody? So once again, this is the Ask Robert section. You can submit your questions to AskRobert at richdadradio.com. And once again, Kim is in Hawaii. And
I am, and it's beautiful here. And I just wanted to make a comment, Robert, because Steven talked about, we went from a manufacturing economy to a knowledge economy, and the knowledge economy was basically the smartest, brightest people in legal and financial. And I remember talking to several guests who were talking about what happened to the school system, and specifically what happened with the MBA programs. And they would say the MBA programs pretty much got hijacked, and all they're teaching is financial and legal. And they weren't teaching business. They weren't teaching how to build a business, how to run a business, anything like that. And that fits right into what Steven is saying, where we went from a manufacturing economy to the knowledge economy, and we put out all these smart legal people and financial people who don't build product and don't create jobs.
Right, that's what it says. That they don't even create assets anymore. They just re-engineer the asset, and they're called
rearrange them.
They're called derivatives and all this. So once again, this is why the Rich Dad Company was formed. So Melissa, what's the first question for Ask Robert?
Our first question today comes from Jessica in Kentucky. Favorite book, Rich Dad's Guide to Investing. I know how important it is to teach my kids about money and wealth creation, but I'm struggling to give them the proper financial education when I didn't have it myself. I want to break this cycle in my own family. Any advice, Robert?
Well, thank you for asking that question because, again, that's why the Rich Dad Company was founded. In 1996, Kim and I created the cash flow board game. Now, why the cash flow board game is very simply this. You can't learn anything reading a book. If you ever look at this thing called the cone of learning, is that the way you learn is by making mistakes. And so I learned everything about money playing Monopoly. So the cash flow game is something you can teach your kids over and over and over again because repetition is the way we learn. But what makes cash flow different than Monopoly is the cash flow game is the only one that teaches the financial statement. And the financial statement's what your banker asks you for when you go to the banker. The banker doesn't want your report card. The banker wants to see your financial statement. And I would say 99%, and probably this person asking this question doesn't have a financial statement. She might have a FICO score. So if you want to really teach your kids, get a cash flow board game and then play the game with them. Play it at least 1,000 times with them until it sinks in their head that assets put money in your pocket and liabilities take money from your pocket. The biggest complaint I have against school, it does two things. It punishes you for making mistakes. So the purpose of a game is for you to make mistakes. And second, they tell you cooperation is cheating. And the Rich Dad Company, you may notice that I have my accountants and my attorneys and my bankers and all that on the program. In the schools, they call that cheating. So the problem with 99% of the people is they went to school and you got brainwashed to think that you have to know all the answers and you should save money and invest for the long term in the stock market. That's the problem. So you want to break that cycle, play the cash flow game. Correct, Kim?
That's exactly what I would tell Jessica. And, we created, it's funny, the cash flow board game was the first product we created. We created that before Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And we created it because people kept asking us, how did we get out of the rat race? How did we become financially free? And we thought, how can we do this in a fun way that's also educating people and that kids and parents can learn together? So the cash flow game was devised so that people could teach people. So you and I, Robert, didn't have to be traveling the world teaching. So it's exactly for that purpose. Parents can teach kids, kids can teach kids, parents can teach parents. It's a natural way to learn, and it's fun.
And the most important thing is that, Kim plays golf all the time. You can't play golf if you don't make mistakes, can you, Kim?
That's right. No, you got to have those bad shots in order to get the good shots.
And the problem with 99% of the people out there being taught by school teachers in their environment and their mindset, making mistakes makes you stupid. In the Rich Dad world, making mistakes make you rich, but you got to make what kind of mistakes to make. So play the cash flow game, people teaching people. There's thousands of clubs all over the world. If you can't afford it, you're in serious trouble because it's less than $100. You go to a college, it's going to cost you thousands, and not going to learn anything about money. So that's why the Rich Dad Company was founded. But more importantly, I would read Steven Brill's book, because your kids in school are getting screwed. Next question, Melissa.
Our next question comes from Emil in Mexico. Favorite book, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Says, Robert, I love to read and study business books. My question is, do you think study on my own is as good a path to my future success as going to college? I'm wanting to start to invest in real estate.
Absolutely not. I'm going to say it one more time. If you read this, there's this thing called the cone of learning. Go to the Rich Dad site. School teachers focus on lecture, which is what they do, which is boring, and reading. The worst way to learn. At the top of the cone of learning came out by a man named Edgar Dale in 1969. That the best way to learn was playing games and doing the real thing. Now, my poor dad never played games. He memorized all the answers and was terrified of making mistakes. And those are the same guys teaching your kids. And you're going to go to school and learn from a teacher who knows nothing about money? The worst thing about it is I get the same questions all the time. These idiots come up to me and they go, I got $300. What should I do with it? And that's the problem with school. They can't think. They want to be told what to do. And naturally, what they're going to tell them to do is save money and put it in the stock market and invest for the long term. Well, that's what they are told to tell you to do. You've got to think for yourself. Comments on that, Kim?
Well, it goes into your new book that you're working on, Robert. So Emil wants to
it's
think
called
about
Fake.
Go to college. Yeah, and there's fake teachers. I mean, in college, I had a lot of teachers, and most of the teachers I had did not practice what they preached. They taught it, but they taught business, but they didn't run a business. They didn't own a business. They didn't even work in a business. So another fast track is to find people that are doing what it is you want to learn to do and study with them. Find mentors. Find people that are actually practicing what they preach. I think that's really important because college is too full of too many teachers who don't practice what they preach.
Yeah, and it's not just school, it's everywhere. You know, there's a lot of financial education courses today put out by everybody. Yep. And a lot of these guys are BS artists. You know, they use all these high-fluting terms that make you confused and all this. The first question you should ask any teacher is, I don't care if it's a seminar teacher or anybody, do you do this in real life? That is the question. Do you have financials? Can you actually see your financials? And I would say 99.99% don't have financials. And if you read Rich Dad, Poor Dad, that's what your banker ask you for. They don't ask you about your report card. They don't ask about your grades. They want to see your financials. And the average guy has no idea what financials are. That's the problem. So just ask your teacher, may I see your financials? And they're going to go, what?
That'll go over well.
And if they don't have financials, I would ask for my money back or walk out.
Even the real estate brokers and stockbrokers, they don't buy real estate, and they don't buy the stocks they're recommending, most of them.
Yep. So once again, I want to thank Steven Brill. His book is called Tailspin. There are Time Magazine articles worth reading. You don't want to read the book. But ladies and gentlemen, you're being screwed by our academic system in more ways than one. So once again, submit your questions to Ask Robert at Rich Dad Radio. Kim, thanks for coming in from Hawaii. And thank you all for listening.